Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Erica George, and it is my pleasure to welcome each of you to this afternoon's virtual Tanner Talk Author Meets Reader conversation. We acknowledge that we are here in Salt Lake City, Utah, coming to you from the unceded ancestral territory lands of the Goshute, the Ute, the Eastern Shoshone, and Paiute peoples, and we're using the technology of Zoom. This is a company headquartered in San Jose, California, on the unceded territory of the Ohlone peoples. And we also acknowledge that the prosperity that we enjoy in the United States is due in significant part to the labor of enslaved individuals. So beyond these acknowledgements, I hope you understand them as an invitation to learn more about the legacy that we've inherited and the connections that we have to our past as we move forward. We are convening during Earth Month, and we are joined by Heather Hauser to celebrate that with us. I am Erica George, Director of the Tanner Humanities Center and the Samuel D. Thurman Professor of Law at the S.J. Quinney College of Law. For those of you who are joining us perhaps for the first time, the Tanner Humanities Center is named for Obert and Grace Tanner. We do work that promotes exploration and engagement with the humanities through academic research, educational enrichment, and our public outreach programs, of which today is one. So thank you for joining for our virtual Tanner Humanities at Home Author Meets Reader featuring former Tanner Fellow, Heather Hauser. So she touches both pillars of work that we do, our academic fellowships as well as our public engagement. I launched Author Meets Reader series just last semester, inspired by work I've been doing in many years with the Lawn Society Association. Annually at that gathering, there's an Author Meets Reader series where new authors, new books, new works are introduced. And the idea is to introduce a writer to their readers, to lifelong learners, and particularly around the issues and themes of the environment. I thought this was critically important and had occasion to meet Heather Hauser and was deeply impressed by the important work that she's been doing. This work is made possible by the O.C. Tanner Foundation, and the public programming is made possible by the Zoo Arts and Parks program, which is funded by you, Utah taxpayers. So I also thank the Tanner Humanities staff, Beth James, Susan Anderson, and Katie Puglia for all the work they've done through pandemic and this past year to bring our programming to you. So without further ado, Heather Hauser. Heather writes on contemporary literature, the environment, and science. She is an associate professor of English at the University of Texas at Austin. Her books include the one we'll talk about today, but also the 2014 Eco-Sickness in Contemporary U.S. Fiction, Environment and Affect, which won the 2015 Association for the Study of Arts Prize, Present Book Prize, and was shortlisted for the British Society for Literature and Science Book Prize. Her research has been supported by the University of Texas at Austin, the Tanner Humanities Center, the American Academy of Sciences, and the Mellon Foundation and the Whiting Foundation. Her academic articles have appeared in Modern Fiction Studies, in the English Language Notes, in American Literary History, and you also can find her writings about readings and her writings in public media sources, most recently the New York Review of Books, where she has an excellent piece on Infowhelm and the pandemic. So her second book, which we are here to talk about today, is Infowhelm, Environmental Art and Literature in the Age of Data, published in 2020. She is also a teacher in addition to being a writer. She is working to build environmental humanities and climate studies at the University of Texas and beyond. She's co-founder of the Planet Texas 2050 project and the UT Austin's inaugural Grand Research Challenge focused on climate resilience. She's led a number of environmental humanities initiatives and is part of the Texas EcoCrits Network, as well as the Texas Institute for Literary and Textual Studies. She advises students in areas of contemporary US literature and culture, environmental humanities, medical humanities, science studies, women and gender studies, affect theory, data and culture, race and ethnic studies, and public humanities. She is a Tanner Scholar, a Tanner Center Fellow. She's a Fellows Fellow. She's working at the nexus of many important issues in ways that enable us to increase our understanding. So it is my true pleasure to introduce Professor Hauser. Heather, welcome.
Thank you, Professor George, and thank you everyone who's in the audience. I'll share my screen in a moment, but I just wanted to thank again Professor George and all the people who brought this this visit into being. So David Rowe and Beth James and Hannah Tobe and Katie Puglia and many others. It's really a joy to return, if virtually, to the Tanner, where I actually finished this book. I was a fellow in 2018 to 2019, and then the book appeared with Columbia University Press in the summer of 2020, which, as you all know, it's not unfortunately in our rearview mirrors, that this was a moment when information overload, one of the themes of the book, was really prominent because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also just the pain and the violence that Black communities and communities of color were experiencing, and all of the sort of media and conversation around that. So it's just really a delight to be here. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully someone can pop into the chat if this is not working. So I thought what I would do is give a brief overview of the book and some of its insights and brief examples as a way to just open things to conversation with anyone in the audience. And so I thought I would do that by first introducing what this concept of Infowhelm means, and then talking about how I explore that concept through the book. And then we can open into some of the implications for one of my areas of research, which is the environmental humanities, but which opens into environmental policy and action writ large. So here's the cover of the book. And so I'll begin with, what is this idea of Infowhelm? So of course we need data to tackle environmental crises, but I think we also know that we need more than data. That data is not meaningful until it's made so through story, through experience, and through all the arts of representation that folks like myself study. And also, I think we know even more and more so today how the propagation of data can perpetuate racial injustice and exploitation and cultural indifference. And I'm actually thinking, I attended a Tanner Center talk with Sophia Noble recently, and just this idea of algorithms of oppression or the gender bias, racial bias that gets inscribed in data. We're becoming more and more attentive to this and thinking about the cultural significance and shaping of data. So when we're confronting this as a society, environmental artists, particularly in the environmental realm of environmental data, they turn to information as an aesthetic resource. So that is scientific information, like some of what I'm showing here on the screen. These are just images and text pulled from the headlines of our recent present. They pull this scientific information and they really use it as the raw material for their artworks. And so the idea of Infowhelm as a concept really captures not only the information overload that we might experience by looking at, here's yet another set of statistics, specifically about extinction and species threat. So it's not only this overload, it's also that a cocktail of emotions that can range from despair to one artist or writer called it infogasm. It can range from despair to infogasm. It can produce confusion, agitation, curiosity. All of these emotions arise when we are confronted with so much data today. And so my interest in Infowhelm and expression in literature and other media was certainly motivated by the dominance of data in the media and in environmental discourse broadly, but then also in what I have here on the screen now is just some of the emotions that come from this. And I just highlighted here this idea of ecological grief that you're seeing more and more in scientific and psychological studies, and also in the popular press. And so just focusing on environmental grief for a moment, In Infowhelm, the book, I look at works like Maya Lin's What is Missing, which is a digital memorial, and works like Brian James's Species in Pieces, which I actually discussed in a talk for Digital Matters when I was a fellow, so won't go into that today. But in looking at works like this, I talk about how these artists are managing data as a way to manage loss, or to think through how the idea of loss not only accompanies the data, the statistics about species threat or cultural threat, but it also, that idea of loss is inscribed in the sciences of biodiversity research as well. And so, sorry, I'm managing some technology here. So with these works and others in the book, they aren't just humanizing the data. And I wanted to emphasize that because it's really something you hear, or at least I hear a lot in conversation with scientists about the role of the humanities. Well, it humanizes the data. I think that's part of it. But the art of Infowhelm is also reproducing this experience of overload to offer ways to navigate data emotionally and experientially. And it really also is situating that experience of Infowhelm in its histories, which are the histories of data, the histories of scientific rationality, the histories of technology and media. And these histories are always shot through with different relations of power. I talk most, I think, often about experiences of colonialism, but also experiences of racial and gender oppression. And so on that note, I do want to underscore that our present, that is the early 21st century, isn't the first era of information explosion, but I do argue that there are certain key features of that explosion today that make Infowhelm a concept with a particular flavor. And so these are some of the elements that I highlight: that data are uncertain and evolving, that they're contested by those in power, and that the stakes of taking action are enormous. And I've given examples here, but I don't think you need them, right? The piece that Erica mentioned that I wrote for New York Review of Books Daily was on COVID-19 and how these elements were in play in the data landscape around that, and continue to be to some extent. And so these attributes of Infowhelm are sort of what inspired me, along with consuming environmental art and literature, that they inspired me to think of this book project, and specifically how cultural works expose and explore those aspects of Infowhelm I just noted. And so with the book, I take up these questions, among others, but to highlight some of the big ones. So how do the arts take up environmental information? And then what happens when that information enters an artwork? How do the arts generate knowledge? And then what theories of knowledge do they offer, in particular as companions to the sciences? And in forwarding these questions, in exploring and answering these questions, I'm really thinking of art as an active mode of knowledge making. So something that goes along with, economic or scientific rationality, that the arts themselves are producing knowledge about environmental crises that we need to take account of. So the artists don't just document the experience of Infowhelm or reproduce it. They actually turn it into a resource for thinking about how we come to know the environment. And specifically, or at least maybe by extension, what epistemological authority the arts can have in these conversations about climate crisis or extinction or extraction. And I think I'll come back to that in a moment, but especially for those who might be defining projects, I thought I would also offer up a definition of my use of scientific information. It's more capacious maybe than it might seem. It's certainly quantitative data, but I also consider the methods used to collect data and the explanations and concepts that artists then incorporate into their works, either as the themes of their works, plot motivators, or as actually the formal structures of their works. So these questions and these ideas arose, as I mentioned, as I was reading contemporary literature, as I was looking at data visualizations in the media, as I was looking at contemporary art, visual art. And so I thought I'd just give a quick taste of a couple ways that I saw this surfacing in contemporary literature, which is actually my home disciplinary base. I am an English professor. And I also decided to share some literary works because when I gave a couple talks at the Tanner or at the University of Utah, I actually was focusing on visual culture. So this gets a bit more at some of the literary aspects of the project. So I'll break down the three sections of the book in a second, but Juliana Spahr's poetry actually runs through the entire book manuscript throughout all the prefaces of the three parts. And this is an excerpt from her poem, Unnamed Dragonfly Species from 2011. She's an experimental poet, also quite vocal on things like labor and gender, but that's a sidebar. And so, as you can probably note, this is a prose poem. And what you're seeing is, I'm not going to read it through, but what you're seeing is a sort of plural speaker named they, who is set off on into this internet rabbit hole after seeing images or a video animation of glacier cleaving. And they start to wonder, like, what does this mean? They start to look for more information. They start to get upset, overwhelmed. And as this narrative of they sort of going into this deep dive, as that's running through the poem, there are also these bold names here that you see on the screen. And those names are actually names of threatened species on the New York threatened species list. And so that comes in, punctuates and interrupts the thoughts of the speaker as a way to sort of replicate that sort of unbidden onslaught of information about environmental damage or threat. And so in this poem, Spahr is dramatizing the stings of climate data that we can encounter on an internet rabbit hole, or we just encounter, listening to the radio. But it's also providing strategies for soothing those stings, thinking about the emotional intricacy of environmental information, and in particular, really expressing the intimacy of information and experience. And that's something that runs through all of Infowhelm. And another example I wanted to share from the literary side, from a writer who's probably more familiar, Barbara Kingsolver, who's known for domestic realism and environmental fiction. In her novel Flight Behavior from 2012, again, I just included a really brief snippet. This is what I think of as a fiction of science rather than science fiction. And what you have in this novel is conversations between an expert lepidopterist named Ovid, and a woman from a working class background without much education. She's a mother, and she is really grappling with the meaning of this new climate information that she's getting from these experts, because a migration of butterflies has landed on her family's land when it shouldn't be there. So it's this really unexpected and even beautiful phenomenon, but she's confronting what it means for in the climate sense, but then also for her and in her identity position. And in this novel, the incorporation of scientific information is really what I call the spur for a coming of mind plot. So instead of the coming of age novel, that's what I'm riffing off of, what you have is people coming to an understanding of climate information and climate phenomena that really unsettles their worldview and has to accommodate the climate information given their socioeconomic and gender and racial positions. And these conversations, the scientific information, is actually a spur for producing analogies. And I just highlighted one, but there are like hundreds or maybe thousands in this novel. And these analogies are ways for sort of showing her brain as a climate data processing mechanism, right? She takes in this climate data and then it gets processed into these analogies, these similes that help make sense of that information, especially in light of her identity. And so I'll pause there, happy to talk about these and other examples, but reading contemporary literature was just really one of the places that I was finding this phenomenon of scientific information. So just a few quick examples, if you follow the arrow, something like Paul Schrader's First Reformed just has in the mise en scène these climate visualizations. And then of course, something like environmental documentaries, famously or infamously An Inconvenient Truth. These are other places where you see this sort of incorporation of scientific information in culture. And so taking note of this like landscape of the arts of the Infowhelm, I divided the book into 3 parts, which I've kind of hinted at already. One is on climate data processing. The other is on the new natural history, which I shared a bit of with Digital Matters a few years ago. And then the final section is aerial environmentalisms, which I actually shared at the Tanner, I think in 2019. And so I'm happy to talk through this all more. I'm moving a bit quickly through the book so we can get to conversation. But I wanted to highlight a few takeaways from analyzing this literature, this visual culture. One of these takeaways is kind of obvious, I've already stated it, but I think it's worth mentioning that information is this raw material for art today. It's not incidental, it's actually structuring the work, providing the plots, and developing even like subgenres of representation as artists and sometimes the characters in the work grapple with this information. Another key takeaway for me is that artistic form is crucial to knowledge production. So we come to know issues like climate change through formal conventions of the works themselves, whether that be like conventions of horror, the conventions of action film, or techniques like the aerial. And all these techniques have their own histories, their own interpretations and associations, and also their own uses for either supporting or resisting regimes of thought and representation. And the final one here is that environmental values arise from epistemological positions and their histories. So this basically means to me that ways of knowing, epistemologies, these ways of knowing that are a part of environmental thought have their roots in certain historical practices, certain technologies that are often shot through with colonialist and racist and sexist practices. And out of these ideas, I developed this idea of entangled epistemologies, another key term for the project. And this really expresses for me how scientific traditions of thought and representation mingle with those aimed at critiquing those traditions. So Enlightenment science, which develops, as I mentioned, alongside and within systems of oppression, actually functions in artworks to present the facts of environmental damage, but also as a way for the artist to think through how science can be in complement to or in conflict with forms of knowing like embodiment, self-reflexivity, emotion, uncertainty, and speculation. And so integrating these various ways of knowing, the arts are really going beyond just communicating stories about environmental crises. I think they're actually overhauling perception, feeling, and thought as a way to start to think through other, or maybe not other, but environmental positions. And so another key takeaway for me in this project is that without new ways of thinking, new relations are impossible. And I just wanted to give a shout out. I'm not the first to have some of these ideas for sure. And so I wanted to highlight some of sort of my fellow travelers in this way of thinking who either appear in the book or like shadow the book, or some of whom I'm more familiar with since writing it. Many of these in Indigenous studies, feminist science studies, and Black studies. And so I'll just have them on the screen there, and can certainly share more about that in conversation. But Donna Haraway, Lorraine Code, Catherine McKittrick, Che Sakakibara, and Kyle White, for those of you who aren't able to look at the screen. And so I wanted to conclude by really thinking about what the stakes are for me, also for the environmental humanities in this project. And one is that is really thinking through how certain positivist Enlightenment forms of knowledge really underpin a lot of our relationships to nature in the West, a lot of environmental policies, and that a lot of this rests on a reliance on data that sort of imports these traditions into our ways of thinking and acting on climate and other environmental issues. And so artists really, they remind us of the ways that scientific information doesn't come to us transparently, ahistorically, objectively. The art can pay deference to science, acknowledge all that it brings to us and teaches us, but it also declares that this knowledge is located in these violent imperialist histories, that it's located in specific racialized, gendered, and situated bodies, and that it's understood as highly mediated and part of technological histories. And so I think I was going to mention something about eco-sickness, but I'm concerned about time, so maybe we can talk about that in a moment. But another key takeaway for me for the environmental humanities is that the arts of Infowhelm are really reflecting on all the forms of mediation of information and how they shape environmental understanding. And this is mediation through power, through scientific values like quantification or objectivity, through aesthetic form, through emotion, through history, and through social and identities positions. And I think the humanities certainly give us ways to understand all these forms of mediation. We're very good at like thinking about mediation and the difference it makes. And that the arts are actually practicing, experimenting with exposing these forms of mediation by incorporating scientific information. And so I'm really hoping the book is extending the dialogue between art and science by showing what it means to honor scientific knowledge without bowing down to some of the technocratic or extractivist responses to planetary crisis that it can sort of lead to if it's only thought of as sort of transparent data. And of course, I think it's also obvious this isn't only an academic exercise for me, though it certainly serves a lot of those purposes. It's also sort of encouraging us to think about how this appears in our daily lives and in our environmental policies today. So I will stop there. And again, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Professor George, for inviting me. And I look forward to having conversation with you all.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I will start with questions. The way that we'll run is I'll be in dialogue with Professor Hauser for just a few moments, and then we'll open to the Q&A, and I see that starting to populate with some questions. I actually want to start where you left off and invite you to talk to us about eco-sickness and the challenge you're presenting to epistemology that's positivist. It struck me that the central part of your project was to interrogate positivism and point out where its limits lie. There's a portion in this book where you talk about Bill McKibben's famous Rolling Stone piece, where we kind of get the parlance around the math and the numbers and the 2%. I'm not persuaded that math is sufficient to move us. So you then take us through, I think, virtually every form of art, from photography to digital arts to literature. I'm not sure if you've done the performing arts, perhaps it's in here too, but all of that spoke to me about emotion. And it seems that eco-sickness left off at that point in your introduction. And I warned Professor Hauser I might ask about this. You write that environmental information is also about thinking about how environmental information feels, how it appears in day-to-day life. When talking about with a coworker about a recent drought or a hurricane or a wildfire, or opening up the news on your smartphone, and thinking about how data instigates emotion. Experience also instigates emotion. When you showed the slide about entangled epistemologies, I think many of us are having the felt lived experience of climate crisis. And I was reminded of exchanges we had earlier in the year, back in February, when there was an event in Austin. And I wanted to invite you to perhaps talk about that on a personal level and how that's informed you professionally.
Yeah, so I'm sure I know the news traveled far and wide, but so much news happens. I'll just remind everyone that, yeah, in I guess mid-February, Central Texas and other parts of Texas experienced this really unprecedented, to use an overused word, freeze and cold that really destroyed the infrastructure in Texas, from the power grid to then threats to water supplies. I actually just saw on a walk the other morning outside of a housing complex a portable shower. So some people still do not have running water in their homes. And it was really this cascade of failures. So of course the power went down, and then the recognition that that those who had power should be conserving it. Those who had natural gas should be conserving it in case that was threatened. And then that the water supply was then also shut down because of all of these cascading failures. I won't go into all the details. So I think that was a data event as well. I mean, not only some of the information just about what was happening with the weather, but if you followed the stories about ERCOT, the sort of body responsible for these power failures, it was just like a slew of information about loads on the grid, threats to the loads, what was shut down, why. So you had this data event, but I think what was so startling to me and to others, and really for me, the first climate event that felt like a crisis, to be differentiated, I think, from what I experience as like a background crisis, like plants blooming earlier than they should, or temperatures reaching points they never had, or like those to me are certainly events, but they can feel like a background crisis. It really was startling to me, that cascade of failures. So the data and the emotional experience of that data, I think, was wrapped into this recognition of fragility of these systems we rely on and maybe don't pay any or much attention to. And then how that really came home to individuals. I was without power for 5 days, but able to go somewhere else, which was, really fortunate. And just how it kind of went through all of those levels, or lived at all of those levels at the same time. And so I think that's, unfortunately been the experience for like millions of people for many years now. And it's going to be the experience of more people, I think, moving forward.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I know this because I was trying to communicate with you at the time via email, and knowing that people in Texas were without power, without water, that some were losing their lives, in significant part because of these failures in the broader conversations we aren't having effectively around how to grapple with climate change. As I took your description of eco sickness, the emotion that overwhelms was grief. And I found myself feeling a lot of anxiety around this, and also anger and frustration. Um, some of the works that you point to in this book, however, aren't all doom and gloom. There are points of hope. There are points that kind of flip our conceptions. I'm thinking of the Barbara Kingsolver novel, and Who Possesses Knowledge and How We Come into Understanding. I wanted to invite you next to comment about that, the notion of the connection between people, those two protagonists, and how we're starting to even quantify ourselves. You have a section of this book that talks about the quantified self and the carbon footprint devices that many of us are using. I've actually assigned it to my students. So could you speak to those and how you selected what was in this book and maybe something you left out? There's a range of different ways that the fiction of science is growing and emerging. You made some very deliberate choices here. So could you speak to those and maybe those that trend towards hopeful emotions, not to be Pollyannish, but just to broaden our conversation?
Yeah, so text selection is always hard. I mean, unlike my first book, Eco Sickness, which maybe had 1 to 2 novels or memoirs per chapter, this book has many, many objects per chapter, which is a sign of something, which maybe it's a lack of self-control, but I think it's more a sign of how much there is out there and how interesting it is, I think, to bounce things off of each other or to see a trend. So in the case of the Barbara Kingsolver, and I don't have much that sort of goes into apocalyptic territory in this novel. There isn't much dystopian. There isn't really, there are things that kind of tease with the dystopian, but nothing really dystopian or doom and gloom, as you said. And I think that was a deliberate, choice. There is a lot of literature on that, and there's a lot of thinking about how the doom and gloom mode can actually stifle thought and response to climate crisis, especially. And so I kind of wanted to veer away from that while still thinking about those mechanisms. And that actually brings me to the Kingsolver. One of the things that I have to say, when I first read the book, I didn't like it that much. I often write about things I don't love, so don't take everything I write about as like a reading list for your own personal enjoyment if you're like me. But it really, when I went back and read it, I was fascinated with how the novel actually encapsulates a lot of theories about how climate change comes to matter, which is the name of a book by Candace Callison. So it actually, in novelistic form, without even, I think, most readers realizing it, it's rehearsing theories like cultural cognition, which is this idea that like your cultural framework, like basically all this climate information is passing through a cultural framework that mediates the information. It's thinking through things like what difference analogy makes. What difference does it make if we can take a bit of scientific information and turn it into something that happens in our day-to-day lives, even if the analogy is wildly different, like shopping in a thrift store, like that excerpt I showed in the slide. So it thinks about the difference that, analogy or finding similarities and differences can make. It also does think through the idea of data deluge and how things like socioeconomic positioning can just really shut out all of this information for very good reason, right? There are other things you need to take care of, like feeding your family or getting a job. And these are theories you can find in like environmental psychology and communication studies, sociology. And so I was really interested in how it created this coming of mind plot and worked through those theories through these two very different characters. So maybe I'll pause there because I can't go into such a long story about every text in the book, but that's one example.
All right, so I'm going to shift now to an audience question and then return perhaps to ask you a bit about more the coming of mind stories, because you also are an educator, and I've noticed your global environmental literature and film course, which looks amazing, and I wish I could take it. So I'll come back to that. But Marilyn Marshall has a question. I just finished reading Writing Wild by Catherine Alto. She highlights nature writing by several authors. The terms eco-poetry and cli-fi, as in climate fiction, were brought up. This seems to go along with what you're saying. Are you familiar with her work? Do you have thoughts, opinions about that work?
Yeah, I think I've heard of that book, but I do not know that book. So I don't know that particular work, but I do, I mean, all these terms, Marilyn, that you put in your question are kind of like contested, or at least they're batted around. Like, for example, the idea of nature writing, some people shy away from it. Some writers shy away from it because it has this history of referring to often white men in an appreciative mode in relationship, or a dominating mode in relationship to nature, that for those writers cannot capture like the diversity of experiences of nature, and or doesn't maybe always capture some of the like the degradation of nature. Now, some people would say, no, nature writing does capture all that. So that's why it's like a contested term. And I would just say, sidebar, if you're interested in thinking about like nature writing and nature poetry from a very like fascinating, irreverent perspective, I recommend Tommy Pico's volume of poems called Nature Poem, where he thinks about writing in the nature writing and eco-poetry tradition as a queer Indigenous man, and like how he does or does not fit into that tradition, but wanting to like hold on to some aspects of it. So eco-poetry sort of has a similar conversation about it as the one around nature writing. Like, some authors don't really want to hold on to that term because it doesn't to them capture their experience or their questions of about what the environment means and how we should relate to it. Yeah, so climate fiction, I mean, I think people use that more readily, you know, fictions that have some kind of plot or key elements about climate change, but also there, like, people are sort of expanding that category to recognize, I guess, that point I made earlier about sort of background crisis. Like, the plot might not be some like action adventure dystopian apocalyptic narrative about climate crisis, but you're finding like in the background of a novel, you know, an author just sort of thinking about what it means to live in a climate changed world. I think of Jenny Alful's book Weather, novel Weather, that just came out. I shouldn't say when things came out because time is so weird right now, so I don't actually remember when it came out, but maybe a year ago. So I'll stop there. But yeah, it's like these terms are really thought through and explored by a lot of writers today.
Okay, I realize I was not fair entirely to Marilyn Marshall, who actually has air quotes around nature writing. So
Yeah.
I think you spoke to that in your answer about how contested that term is. One of the things I appreciated about your writing as well as your presentation was the way that you are very conscious about what voices have not been included, what's been excluded, and giving voice to that. You cite one of my favorites, Kyle White. I really appreciate his work. And in your teaching, I wanted to invite you to talk about your teaching philosophy. You write and maybe have coined the term the coming of mind. We are, as educators, responsible for encouraging our students to think and to learn. We've got contested truths. You even write about how this has been true, particularly in a COVID-19 age, in the time of climate change. So in terms of what our minds need to come to, what we need to be able to comprehend, how have you integrated some of your scholarship in service of your teaching, in particular the global environmental literature and film class, because it struck me as very global. You also reference a person, kingsolver, that I wanted to invite you to talk about.
Yeah, that class I've taught a couple times now, and I have a bad or good habit, depending on how you look at it, of like overhauling syllabi every time I teach a course. But actually, Sarah Wiwa has been there throughout the permutations of this class. But one of the things I certainly emphasize in that class is one thing I emphasize, at least, is this idea of the future crisis is present for many people and even past for many people. I mean, I think Kyle White's work, you mentioned him a moment ago, of thinking about how, and among other Indigenous studies scholars, like thinking about how the apocalypse has already come. I mean, Black studies scholars also think about this, like that there are peoples for whom like the present is a post-apocalyptic moment. And so in that class, I like to look across, not that, I mean, that's maybe a hard thing. It is a hard thing to talk about, but we think about that head on and think about how it can be easy from a position of privilege in the United States to think that, you know, changes to land use or changes to water availability are something we have to deal with in the future. But actually, these are things that people are living with today. And just to think about how communities, artists, different national traditions are responding to that, and not always in this like doom and gloom mode, but thinking of forms of resistance, which is where someone like Sarah Wiwa, and I also teach writings by Wangari Maathai and some documentaries about people have stood up for their communities and their lands to show the forms of response and resistance that get expressed through literature. That is, I think, really meaningful. It's not always successful, so we deal with those like hard feelings of things that don't work out. But yeah, to really show that there are ways of responding and resisting that people have been performing, right, for decades and centuries. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Fantastic. There's another question in the chat that I'll come to. And I wanted to say I was so impressed with the lists of readings, and I hope you will send us things that you've been referencing in this conversation and the recommendations you've made. I actually learned about Kingsolver Wiwa from his human rights case. I'm a human rights lawyer. It was only later that I learned that he was a poet. So it's National Poetry Month. I thought it appropriate to mention him, and I'll read him alongside Judith Spahr, who I wasn't familiar with until I'd read your book. But often the voices of environmentalists and environmental artists are set to be repressed or shut down. So to share this is tremendous. Thank you for that. Anne Royalston has the next question. She says, quote, "I first wanted to note how much I enjoyed Infowhelm and to thank you for writing it, exclamation point. It has been very helpful as I think through my own current project, which deals in part with bioart and its ethical implications. How do you see art that incorporates non-human minds or being in conversation with your ideas in Infowhelm, if at all?"
Yeah, so I do have one, to your point a minute ago, Erica, about like the book seems to include everything, except for maybe like dance, which is something I love and do, but is not in the book. And actually film, I decided not to write about film because a lot of people do write about film, but I do have some bio art in there. And for me, when I look at that in the context of, as I said, the new natural history, I was interested in how these bio artists actually draw from these traditions of natural history representation and taxonomy and classification as a way to unsettle so some of the positions of mastery or control that can come through in the rhetoric, at least, of the traditions of natural history. I have a lot in the book about how those rhetorics of natural history are always already, to use an old phrase, unsettled, but that there's this idea that you can understand and classify, categorize, organize, and display sort of the variety and complexity of the natural world. And I think bio artists are, on one hand, like stepping into that position of mastery because they're using these complex techniques. They're scientists themselves in many cases, but they're also unsettling that position of mastery by thinking about how these creatures, these agencies, these assemblages, to use some other keywords out there, how they kind of break free of the structures and forms of control that they, the artists, might put into place. So that's one way I think about it. And another way, also in that new natural history section, I write about a novel by Verlin Klinkenborg called Timothy, or Notes on an Abject Animal, I think is its title. And this is told from the perspective of the tortoise, who was actually one of Gilbert White's tortoises that lived in his garden. It was like a specimen that was brought to him from afar. and sort of thinking about this being as a displaced being, someone who's sort of subject to the sort of curiosity and expeditions and collecting impulse of colonialism that is a part and parcel of natural history, and sort of like how the animal experiences that displacement and tries to like understand it's actually her place in this as a displaced being. So those are some of the ways it appears in my interpretations of work, but I think there are also, other ways that this idea of Infowhelm could pertain to a project like that one.
Wonderful. So I probably should do the responsible thing and conclude our conversation, but one last question, because your displacement made me think of it. You also have displacement in the mismigration of the monarch butterflies when you talk about kingsolver. Were there particular themes of Infowhelm that went across all three categories, the aerial, the natural, new natural environment, and the climate change, that you want your readers to really take away and take forward?
Yeah, some surprising, like anyone who's done a long project, right? It evolves and you are sort of one day can be startled by the things that are running through. I do think displacement is one of them, but I want to highlight also something I just mentioned is mastery, sort of the desire to master, control, to dominate. This is really running through everything from climate modeling to the natural history, to the reliance on the aerial and satellite imagery. And that's not to say that everyone in whatever field they are who employs these is like intending to occupy a position of mastery or dominance, but there's something about those technologies and their histories and how they go hand in glove with things like imperialism or military conquest or displacement of other peoples, like that. It's sort of like that desire to master and control can often run. It's sort of like, I think of it as being like encoded in those technologies or those traditions of thought. And then the artists who adopt them or repurpose them in their work are sort of like thinking through that position of mastery as a way to often undo it, like as a foil for it. So that was a big one that ran through that book, but also like this whole idea of repurposing, or like how artists will take up these really contested or fraught technologies or media as a way to think through those very like conditions of them being fraught and use them to different purposes. So that kind of ran through as I was writing the book, if not from its origins.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, I'm glad it ended up where it has been, and I know you'll go forward and do amazing, interesting work. I do now have to do the responsible thing and close this session because Professor Hauser has another one to get to just after this. So again, please join me in thanking Professor Hauser, as well as the Tanner Humanities staff and our sponsors. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.